Welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're tackling something pretty interesting, basic English conversation.
And simple, right.
Exactly. But we're going to be using this website, Helena Daily English, as our guide.
Mhm.
And
It's really fascinating.
yeah, and you'd be surprised how much these everyday phrases we all use, reveal about like the culture of English speakers.
Yeah. We often take these expressions like completely for granted, like how are you or
Right.
nice to meet you. But they are just packed with these little subtle cues and really social strategies that are illuminating, especially if you're learning English or just curious about how language works in general.
It is. And we're going to look at all kinds of things. How to decline an invitation politely, what to say if you're lost,
Mm-hmm.
even like the unspoken rules of ordering food.
Yes. Things you might encounter every single day if you're
Yeah.
living in an English-speaking country.
Right. And what's so interesting, I think, is how these simple interactions highlight the importance of politeness
Right?
in English-speaking
Yeah.
cultures. So, for example, you'll see a lot of indirect language
Yeah.
and this real focus on like minimizing imposition, even in very basic exchanges.
Right.
So let's unpack some of this stuff, starting with those first encounters, right? So Helena Daily English has this 100 daily topics, and it starts, predictably with greetings, introductions, like the all-important, do you speak English?
Yes. The essential question for any traveler.
Right. But there's a lot we can unpack, I think, even in these first few phrases.
Yeah, absolutely. Like take, for example, the seemingly simple phrase, nice to meet you too,
Right.
right? It's not just a reciprocal greeting. I mean, it's not just being polite. It actually signals, a willingness to engage.
Yeah.
And it sort of establishes this sense of rapport.
It's true. And it's so subtle, too.
It is.
Like, it's such a subtle social dance.
Yeah.
And even, something like, just, excuse me, like we say, excuse me, before we even ask if someone speaks English.
Right.
And that phrase serves a deeper purpose, really,
Mm-hmm. For sure. It's like you're acknowledging the potential inconvenience you might be causing by
Yeah.
even asking this question.
And it just softens the request.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's about minimizing imposition and also showing respect for the other person's time and space.
Exactly.
And this focus on politeness, you'll see it like throughout all of these English conversations.
It makes you wonder, if this emphasis on being indirect ever leads to misunderstandings.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially with people from cultures that value more direct communication.
All the time. I mean, all the time.
Yeah.
That potential for miscommunication is always there.
Right.
I mean, for example, in some cultures, a direct no is perfectly acceptable.
Right.
But in, generally in English-speaking cultures, it can come across as abrupt or even rude.
Oh, for sure. So how do like English speakers navigate those situations where they need to say no without causing offense?
Right. Well, that's where the art of saying no politely comes in.
Okay.
And we see this in lessons 7 and 8, where the speakers use phrases like, sorry, that's too late, or I can't go today,
Right.
to decline these invitations.
I see.
And you'll notice that the language is indirect. And they're often including these explanations or apologies
Mhm.
to soften that rejection.
It's so interesting to think about. I mean, we rely on these unspoken rules so much. It's kind of like a secret code to navigate social situations.
It is.
Yeah. And speaking of navigating, lesson 4 takes us into the world of like asking for directions.
Yeah, a classic scenario for travelers and newcomers.
Right. I mean, I'm looking for the airport, or
Mhm.
do you know if there's a restroom around here?
Yeah. It just highlights how crucial clear communication is when you're in when you're in unfamiliar territory.
Totally. And it's interesting, too, how those phrases like reveal this underlying assumption that that other people are going to help you,
Right.
even if they're total strangers.
Yeah.
Like you just assuming that they're going to be helpful.
There is that element of trust involved. Yeah.
Yeah.
This expectation that people will like generally be helpful and provide guidance.
Right.
If they can. Of course, this will vary a lot depending on the context and the location.
Of course.
But it is an interesting sort of cultural assumption to consider.
It is. Okay, so we've talked about greetings, asking for help, and the art of polite refusal.
Right.
But now I'm getting hungry. And it seems like Helena Daily English is too, because the next set of lessons takes us straight to the dinner table.
It's true. I mean, food is just such a central part of social life. And these conversations really showcase how we use language to navigate those shared experiences.
That's right. So starting with lesson 5, we see how to express hunger. I'm hungry, I'd like to eat something. And even how to suggest a specific type of cuisine, like I'd like to go to an Italian restaurant.
Right, right. And what's fascinating here is that food acts as this social lubricant.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, these phrases aren't just about stating a need like, I need to eat,
Right.
I'm starving. They're actually invitations to connect,
Yeah,
to share a meal and potentially build a relationship.
that makes sense. So it's like the food itself becomes a common ground for conversation
Exactly.
and connection.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then the conversation, continues in lessons 6, 9, and 10,
Yeah.
where we see how people offer drinks, suggest meeting times, and ultimately, navigate the art of ordering food.
Exactly. And even in those really mundane exchanges, like, what would you like to eat? You can see how English speakers use language to create this really welcoming and hospitable atmosphere.
So true.
Yeah. I mean, phrases like, would you like something to drink? Or what would you like to eat? They go beyond just taking an order.
Yeah.
They really demonstrate a concern for the other person's preferences and comfort.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. It's almost like it's an unspoken rule of dining etiquette.
Yeah.
Right? Like you offer a drink as this gesture of hospitality, and you ask about preferences to show respect for the other person's choices.
Precisely. And all of this is happening beneath the surface of what might seem like a very simple conversation.
Right.
It's a great example of how much cultural knowledge is embedded in the language we use every day.
It really makes you rethink those basic English phrases that we all thought we knew so well. Like I'm starting to see them in a whole new light.
For sure.
But what happens when those conversations don't go quite as smoothly?
Right.
What if there's a miscommunication or a difference of opinion?
Oh, that's where things get even more interesting. And luckily, Helena Daily English provides some great examples of how English speakers handle those inevitable communication breakdowns.
Okay, perfect. So let's dive into those tricky situations and see what we can learn about navigating those conversational bumps in the road.
Sounds good. So one example that really stood out to me was in lesson 9, where there's this confusion about the proposed meeting time.
Yeah, that's a situation we've probably all experienced. I thought it was interesting how the speakers handled the miscommunication. These phrases like, can you say that again, please? Or did you say 7.00?
Exactly. And those clarification requests are just so important for preventing misunderstandings, from snowballing into something bigger. And it also highlights the role of active listening in successful communication. It's not just about hearing the words. You have to make sure you've actually understood the meaning.
Right. It's like you're constantly checking in.
Yeah,
And clarifying, especially when you're dealing with specific times or dates.
for sure. And pronunciation plays a role here too, especially for English learners.
Right.
Clear articulation can really minimize the chances of mishearing or misinterpreting.
It makes you realize how much we take for granted those little phrases that we use to smooth over these bumps.
It's true. Like, we often focus on learning all the vocabulary and the grammar,
Right.
but those conversational repair strategies are just as important
Yeah.
for real-world fluency.
As we're talking about these everyday conversations, I'm struck by how much they reflect the values and social norms of English-speaking cultures.
That's a great point. And one value that keeps coming up is this emphasis on politeness and consideration for others. It's evident in the way people phrase requests or offer help and even decline invitations.
It's true. Like
Yeah.
in lesson 4, when Michael is asked for directions to the airport, he doesn't just say, I don't know.
Right.
He adds, sorry, which softens the response and shows empathy, for the person who's lost.
Exactly. It's such a small addition, but it makes a big difference in how the interaction feels. And we see that same kind of consideration in other examples, like in lesson 6, when David is offered coffee but doesn't have any. Instead of just saying no coffee, he says, sorry, I don't have any coffee, which is, acknowledging the offer and softening the refusal.
It's like there's this underlying script for these interactions.
Yeah.
A set of social cues that we follow to know how to respond in different situations.
That's a great analogy. And while there might be some cultural variation, those scripts are surprisingly consistent
Right.
across many English-speaking cultures.
Which makes me wonder how much of this translates to other English-speaking regions,
Yeah.
like, the UK or Australia. Would you say these patterns hold true across the board?
It's a great question. And while the core principles, the politeness, the indirectness, they're generally present in many English-speaking cultures.
Right.
There are definitely regional variations in how they're expressed.
So the specific phrases might be different, or the level of formality might vary.
Exactly. So, for instance, in British English, you might hear, please, could you, instead of just can you, adding a layer of formality. Or think about the word cheers, which in British English can be used for so many things besides just toasting.
Oh, that's right. It could be like a thank you or a goodbye or even just a general acknowledgement.
Exactly. It's a wonderfully versatile word. So, yes, even within the world of English, there's a lot of diversity and nuance.
That's what makes language learning so fascinating.
It is.
It's not just about memorizing these words and grammar rules. It's really about exploring these different cultures and ways of interacting
It is.
with the world. And speaking of exploring, I've noticed how often food comes up as a topic in these Helena and daily English conversations. It's almost like this recurring character.
You're absolutely right. From discussing what to eat, to making plans to go to restaurants, to simply expressing hunger.
Right.
It's woven into the fabric of these everyday interactions.
It makes you wonder if it's more than just sustenance in English-speaking cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe it's also a way to connect with others or to share experiences or even to signal social status.
That's a really insightful observation. I mean, food is often a focal point for social gatherings and celebrations.
Right.
Think about how many times you've caught up with friends over a meal, or marked a special occasion with a dinner out.
That's true. And in those situations, the language around food becomes even more important.
Right.
Like we need to be able to express preferences, offer food and drinks, navigate dietary restrictions. It's like a whole social dance in itself.
It is. And these Helena Daily English conversations give us this glimpse into how that dance plays out in real life situations.
Right.
Like, take lesson 10, for example, where we see someone ordering food at a restaurant.
Okay.
Those phrases like, what would you like to drink? Or I'll have the tuna fish sandwich and a bowl of vegetable soup might seem mundane, but they're essential for navigating this very specific social context.
And it's not just about the customer's language.
Yeah.
Like the waiter's responses, like, welcome to the French Garden restaurant. Please have a seat. Your waitress will be with you in a moment.
Ugh.
All of that contributes to creating this welcoming, hospitable atmosphere.
Exactly. It's like this carefully choreographed script
Yeah.
that's been honed over time to ensure, smooth and pleasant interactions.
It makes you wonder how those scripts might differ in different cultures.
Yeah.
What would the ordering process look like in a restaurant in Japan, for instance,
Yeah.
or Italy?
That's a fantastic question. And it highlights how even these seemingly simple interactions are infused with cultural norms and expectations.
Yeah.
Like, I encourage you to pay attention to how people order food in movies or TV shows
Oh, interesting.
that are set in different countries. You might be surprised by the subtle differences in language and etiquette.
That's such a great tip. It's like turning everyday life into this cultural observation exercise.
Yeah. It really is. And that's what makes language learning so rewarding. It's not just about acquiring a new skill. It's about opening your eyes to new ways of seeing the world.
So we've talked about politeness, navigating unfamiliar situations, the role of food in social interactions, and even those cultural nuances of language. But one aspect we haven't fully explored is like that emotional layer of communication. How do these basic English conversations reflect the feelings and intentions of the speakers? After all, communication is about more than just conveying information.
Mm-hmm.
It's also about expressing ourselves and connecting with others, on an emotional level.
That's a brilliant observation. You're absolutely right. While these conversations might seem, focused on very functional language,
Yeah.
the emotions are definitely there, simmering beneath the surface.
For example, in Lesson 7, when Mary has to decline the dinner invitation because it's too late, you can sense her disappointment.
Yeah.
She doesn't just say, no, I can't. She says, sorry, that's too late. Conveying regret and a desire to maintain that relationship.
Exactly. And in Lesson 8, when Jennifer is, choosing a time to meet for dinner, you can hear her enthusiasm when she finally agrees on a time and place. She says, okay, I like that place, expressing her pleasure and eagerness to participate.
Right. And even in those really simple phrases like, how are you? Or nice to meet you, there's this implied warmth and friendliness that goes beyond the literal meaning of the words.
Absolutely. Language is a powerful tool for conveying emotions, even in those most basic conversations.
Yeah.
And as you become more fluent in English, you'll start to pick up on those subtle cues
Right.
that reveal the speaker's underlying feelings and intentions.
It's not just about what we say, but how we say it.
Precisely. Tone of voice, facial expressions, body language.
Right.
All of these contribute to the emotional landscape of a conversation.
It really highlights how much is communicated
Yeah,
beyond the words themselves.
for sure. It certainly does. And
Yeah.
it's something to be mindful of as you continue your English language journey. Pay attention to how native speakers use their voices and their bodies to convey those emotions. And don't be afraid to experiment with your own nonverbal communication.
Right.
The more you practice, the more natural it will become.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today,
Mhm.
from navigating those first encounters and handling miscommunications to exploring the subtle role of food in social interactions and even delving into those emotional nuances of language.
Right.
But I think what's most striking is how much we can learn about English-speaking cultures and communication styles from these, seemingly basic conversations.
I couldn't agree more. These everyday interactions are like little windows into the hearts and minds of
Mhm.
English speakers, revealing their values, their social norms, even their emotional landscapes.
They remind us that language is so much more than just a set of rules and vocabulary. It's really this living, breathing system that reflects the complexities of human interaction. And on that note, are you ready to wrap up this part of our deep dive and move into our final section where we explore how these insights can actually help you on your own language learning journey?
I'm ready when you are. Let's take a short break and come back refreshed for our final insights and takeaways.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into basic English conversation. It's been pretty fascinating,
He
right?
really has. I mean, these phrases might seem basic, but
Right.
we've really uncovered a lot, haven't we? And I think one of the biggest takeaways here for anyone who is learning English, or any language really, is that context is everything.
Yeah.
You can't just memorize a list of words and grammar rules. You need to see how these language elements are actually used in real life situations to really understand their meaning and impact.
Yeah, like, knowing how to say, I'm hungry is important. But that's just the beginning.
Right. Understanding how to use that phrase to suggest going to a restaurant or politely ask for a snack or even just to make conversation, that's where the real learning happens.
Exactly. And that's where resources like Helena Daily English
Yeah.
are so valuable because these conversations, they provide that real-world context.
Right.
They show you how those basic phrases fit into these larger dialogues
Yeah.
and how you can use them to achieve different communication goals.
Yeah. It's like they're giving you a blueprint for constructing your own conversations,
Yeah.
but in a way that feels natural.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And that's key for developing real fluency.
Yeah.
By studying these examples, you start to internalize the patterns of English conversation and then gain the confidence to use those patterns in your own interactions.
So it's like you're learning by osmosis.
Yeah.
You're just absorbing these nuances of the language
I love that analogy.
through observation and analysis.
And it's especially helpful, I think, for people who feel overwhelmed.
Yeah. By just the sheer amount of information there is to learn.
Right, because let's be honest, learning a new language can feel really daunting.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge undertaking.
What advice would you give to someone who's maybe feeling a bit lost,
Yeah.
in this sea of vocabulary and grammar rules and cultural nuances?
I would say start small and focus on the practical.
Okay.
Don't try to learn everything at once. Just pick a few key phrases that you can use every day
Yeah,
and master those. Then as you get more comfortable, you can gradually expand your repertoire.
right. That's great advice. It's so easy to get caught up in that feeling that you need to learn everything quickly.
Yeah.
But sometimes slowing down and focusing on the fundamentals is the most effective approach.
Absolutely. And remember that language learning is a journey.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a destination. There will be moments of frustration and times when you feel like you're not progressing
Yeah.
as quickly as you want. But it's important to celebrate those small victories along the way.
Yeah, that's so true.
And just remember that every interaction,
Yeah.
every attempt to communicate, it's a learning opportunity.
It really is. And, as you progress, you'll find that you're not just gaining a new skill, you're also expanding your understanding of the world.
That's right.
Language is such a powerful tool for connecting with people from all different cultures and backgrounds.
Right.
And the more you learn, the more those connections become possible.
Absolutely.
So speaking of connections, one thing that really struck me as we were looking at these conversations was the power of nonverbal communication.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing how much we convey through our body language or tone of voice, our facial expressions,
It's true.
even when we're not really aware of it.
And those nonverbal cues play a huge role in how our messages are received
Right.
and interpreted. And they can be especially important when you're learning a new language where, a subtle difference in a gesture or intonation can totally change what you're trying to say.
Like in lesson 9, where that miscommunication about the meeting time happened,
Right.
You could just sense the confusion,
Yeah,
not just from the words, but also from their tone of voice and facial expressions.
exactly. Being able to read those nonverbal cues is so important for understanding the full context of a conversation.
Yeah.
And it's a skill that develops over time with practice and exposure to the language.
So as you're learning English, pay attention to how native speakers use their bodies and their voices
Mm-hmm.
to convey meaning. Observe how they use gestures, how their tone changes, how their facial expressions reflect their emotions.
That's excellent advice. And don't be afraid to experiment with your own nonverbal communication.
Yeah.
The more you practice, the more natural it will become.
That's great advice. So we've covered a lot in this deep dive. We've talked about the importance of context, the
Yeah.
power of nonverbal communication, the many ways that basic English conversations can give us these insights into culture and communication styles.
Right.
I think the most important takeaway is that even these seemingly simple interactions
Mm-hmm.
are actually so rich with meaning and nuance.
Absolutely. They're like little treasures, each one offering this glimpse into the complexities of, human connection and communication.
And they remind us that language learning, it's more than just this cognitive exercise.
Right.
It's about opening ourselves up to new ways of seeing the world
Yeah.
and experiencing it.
Beautifully said. And with that in mind, I'd like to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question.
Okay.
How might the way we express ourselves in our native languages shape the way we perceive the world?
That's a great question. It really gets you thinking about the connection between language and culture and perception.
It does, and I encourage you to continue exploring that connection.
Yeah.
Pay attention to how language is used in different contexts. Observe those subtle nuances of communication.
Yeah.
And consider how your own native language might actually be influencing your worldview.
It's an ongoing journey,
It is.
full of fascinating insights. And, whether you're a seasoned language learner or just starting out, I think the most important thing is to embrace the process. Celebrate those small victories
Right.
and never stop exploring the wonders of human language.
Well said. Happy learning, everyone.